This is the Fortress of Verdun, and what happened here in 1916 says a lot about what people are capable of doing to each other. Some of the most horrifying things of the entire First World War happened right on this ground, and that's exactly what you're going to hear now. But to understand why that happened, we have to go back to where it all started. By late 1915, the Western Front had taken more than 1 million lives for almost absolutely nothing. A deadlock of 25,000 miles of trenches and no man's land was something entirely new, created by the first large-scale deployment of machine guns and quick-firing artillery that had erased all the conventional tactics of open cavalry and infantry charges. Industrialized warfare produced casualties simply never seen before in the world, and no one had the right answer to the trenches that sprouted the moment no side could outmaneuver the other. Men were getting killed at an alarming rate in failed attempt after failed attempt to break the lines. For an entire year, the Allies had been trying to break this deadlock by sheer force. When one huge-scale attack failed, they simply tried another even larger one, and when that also failed, they tried an even larger one after that. And pretty soon, one thing became clear. It couldn't be done by any conventional means they could think of, and they would literally run out of soldiers if they kept going this way. Days of heavy artillery preparation, with millions of shells, then hundreds of thousands of men charging would break the first line of defense at best, then stop dead at the second, where the barbed wire was intact and where they would be mowed down by machine guns, and then a counterattack would beat them back to the starting line. Nothing changed besides thousands and thousands of soldiers dying for absolutely nothing, although this didn't really stop them from sending their men into pointless charges anyway. However, one German general came up with an idea for how to win over France. He argued that their main enemy, the British, couldn't be destroyed by land directly, but if they could destroy the French first, they would destroy any British power in Europe. His idea was that if the front couldn't be broken, don't even try to break it. Instead, because defense with machine guns, quick-firing artillery and barbed wire was so much stronger than any offensive tactic they could think of, German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn decided to create a trap that would slowly kill the French army, rather than trying to break everything in one dramatic offensive. He decided to exhaust it, bleed it, drain it slowly until it could no longer continue the war. And how do you do that? Well, instead of a full-scale attack across the whole front, you pick one target where you can concentrate your forces and capture it, but more importantly, one that your enemy cannot afford to lose. You pick something that has to be incredibly important to them, either in strategic, symbolic, or emotional terms, something so tied to French pride that their leaders couldn't abandon it without national humiliation. Then, once you have that position in your hands, you make sure you can hold it firmly and just wait for France to counterattack. Machine guns and artillery, like we said, always favor the defender, so this way they would hold the position as long as they could, let the French come into prepared killing zones over and over again, inflicting catastrophic losses, and like the name of the tactic said, ausbluten, bleed the French white. Now, why Verdun specifically? Well, first it sat in a salient, which means a part of a battle line that sticks out into enemy territory. After the Germans captured Saint-Mihiel in 1914, the French position around Verdun stuck out weirdly into German lines, where the Germans could approach it from 3 sides, making it geographically exposed and a very attractive target. Second was logistics. Verdun was connected only by one narrow-gauge railway and one long road from Bar-le-Duc, and that supply artery was extremely vulnerable. On top of that, German logistics in this sector were better, so they could concentrate and supply their own artillery far more efficiently. And last but not least, the most important factor for this tactic specifically, Verdun carried a name going back to the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which divided Charlemagne's empire and basically shaped the future of both France and Germany. Then, during the Franco-Prussian War, Verdun was one of the last fortresses to fall, making it a symbol of French fighting spirit and resistance. For the dirty German enemies to take it from them would be like spitting in the face of every single French man. And that is exactly what the Germans wanted. They knew the French would do everything to take Verdun back if they captured it. However, here is the first irony in this story. After seeing the Belgian forts destroyed by large-caliber German siege guns in 1914, which pretty much ended the era of traditional fortresses, French High Command decided that fortresses were now obsolete and couldn't be used for defense the way they had been before super heavy artillery came into play. So, even though French forts were much stronger than the Belgian ones, with reinforced thick concrete and sand cushions designed to absorb heavy hits, they began stripping their forts of heavy guns and ammunition, reducing garrisons and basically weakening the defenses. The reasoning was to prevent something like Fort Vaux, where a magazine with 12 tons of gunpowder was hit by an artillery shell, blew up the entire fort and killed hundreds of men. So, throughout 1915, guns were removed from Verdun's forts, ammunition stocks and garrisons were reduced. Fort Douaumont, the strongest of them all, went from a full garrison of over 800 men to barely 50 elderly reservists under a warrant officer, with some defensive positions literally unmanned and trenches left incomplete. Officers were warning High Command that Verdun was dangerously exposed, but politicians, as always, knew better and did nothing about it, keeping their attention on the failed offensives that were exhausting France. And as you can now see, this is what led directly to the Battle of Verdun, because the Germans were watching carefully and preparing. Everything was ready for the horrors about to come. Now, before the battle itself, just a brief overview of the fortress system around Verdun, so you can get a sense of the scale of what was about to be fought over. The city of Verdun sits on the Meuse River, which runs roughly north to south through the area, splitting the battlefield into two halves, the right bank and the left bank. The French had built a massive system of fortifications in the hills surrounding the city, designed to block any German invasion from the east, and the system was arranged in two concentric rings. The outer ring had about 22 large forts on the high ground, while the inner ring had about 6 smaller forts closer to the city, and in between and around them were many more smaller fortified positions that we can call strong points. The important thing is that the forts were designed to support each other, meaning each one could cover its neighbors with artillery fire. They were built from thick, reinforced concrete with steel doors, gun turrets, observation cupolas, machine gun positions, and whatnot. Now, for the purposes of this story, you don't need to know all 28 forts, because the German attack came from one direction, hitting the right bank of the Meuse. On February 21st, 1916, at 7:15 in the morning, across a front of roughly 12 miles on the right bank of the Meuse, over 1,200 German guns opened fire simultaneously on a concentrated scale unlike anything the war had seen before. Among them were the infamous Big Bertha 420mm siege howitzers and 380mm naval guns, alongside hundreds of heavy mortars. The bombardment was walked systematically across the French front, first blasting trenches and communication lines, then artillery positions, and finally the woods where defenders had taken cover, shredding them completely over 9 hours of continuous fire. The French soldiers who survived it were shell-shocked and mentally broken by the sheer violence of a barrage they had never experienced before. And this was just the beginning. At around 4 in the afternoon, the German infantry was sent forward cautiously to probe the French defenses and see how many had actually survived. And despite the shattered terrain from that horrific bombardment, roughly half of the French defenders were still alive. And they put up a surprisingly strong fight, despite being shell-shocked out of their minds and desperately outnumbered. In one wooded area, German stormtroopers ignored their orders to advance cautiously and managed to break through the French line after 5 hours of heavy fighting, taking the entire wood. But that was the only real German success of the day. Everywhere else, the French held on with far tougher resistance than anyone had expected. The other sections didn't fall until the following day, but casualties were already horrible on both sides. What followed was a slow but steady collapse of the shattered French defenses. On the next day, the Germans brought in flamethrowers to clear out the last defenders in the forward positions. By February 24th, the entire 8 miles of the outer French lines had collapsed and the divisions holding them had effectively ceased to exist. The Germans deployed 96 flamethrower teams, and the effect on fixed defensive positions was just horrific, with soldiers running to the rear with their clothes and hair on fire. So, by February 25th, the forward French defenses were gone. The woods and trenches that made up the outer line had been overrun, and the Germans were now pushing into the area where the actual forts were. By February 26th, after just 5 days of fighting, French losses stood at around 24,000. German losses were about 25,000. And the battle had just begun. The first major fort in their path was Fort Douaumont, the largest and most important of all the fortifications around Verdun. It sat on the highest ground on the right bank, and because of that elevation, whoever held it could observe and direct artillery fire across practically the entire battlefield. Before the war, it had been considered the strongest fort in Europe. When fully manned, it could hold close to 1,000 men. But it wasn't fully manned. Because of that decision French High Command had made the year before, Douaumont had been stripped of almost everything. The garrison was reduced to a crew of about 60 middle-aged territorial reservists, On the afternoon of February 25th, a Saxon pioneer sergeant named Felix Otto Kunze, commanding 10 combat engineers, reached the fort's moat. He found an opening in the wall that had been blown open by a German shell, and he got the idea to climb through. His own men refused to follow him, but he went in by himself anyway, armed with just a rifle. He wandered through the dark, empty corridors of the fort, following the sound of the single gun, still firing blindly from inside. There he found a 4-man crew whom he captured and locked in a room. He went further and found a mess hall with food still on the tables, so he sat down and ate properly, despite the carnage going on all around him, while the captured French soldiers watched him, probably wondering what on earth had just happened. Shortly after, his reinforcements finally arrived, and there were soon about 90 Germans inside the fort, capturing the whole thing without a single shot fired and without a single casualty. So much for the toughest fort in Europe. The fall of Douaumont sent shockwaves through French command while the Germans celebrated. But if they knew what awaited them, no one would be celebrating, because over the following 8 months, the French launched repeated counterattacks trying to recapture the fort they had so easily lost, with casualties piling up to around 100,000 soldiers going exactly according to the plan the Germans had made. In just one of many attacks on this fort, 12,000 men were sent to retake it, and in 36 hours they were pushed back with almost 6,000 casualties. That gives you just a glimpse of the horrors there, but let's get into how the actual fighting really looked. The fighting quickly became savage close-quarters combat and, horribly often, hand-to-hand, where grenades and shovels became the main infantry weapons. The rifle was almost useless because there was simply no room to aim and fire properly. Attacking soldiers would throw grenades into a cluster of shell holes or a section of collapsed trench, then rush in while the defenders were stunned. If the defenders were still alive, it turned into hand-to-hand fighting in the mud, with bare hands. Both sides used chemical shells throughout the battle. The Germans started with tear gas, trying to force soldiers out of cover. Then they escalated to phosgene, whose effects on the human body are just horrifying, and the French responded with the same weapon. You can later watch our video on the horrors of chemical weapons in World War I if you'd like to know more about that. Now, French General Pétain took over command, and after arriving at Verdun, he cancelled all plans for retreat and ordered the remaining forts to be reinforced instead. He immediately did 2 things that would keep Verdun alive for the rest of the battle. The first was the supply road. If you remember from the beginning, we said that Verdun was in a salient with very thin supply lines, and eventually everything fell on a single narrow road of 35 miles from the town of Bar-le-Duc. This road became their lifeline, and over the course of the battle, there were roughly 8,000 vehicles on it at any given time. Around 2.5 million men were transported along this road, 2 million tons of supplies, and some 800,000 wounded were evacuated down it. The second thing was the rotation system. Unlike the Germans, who couldn't afford to do this, General Pétain organized a system where divisions went in and out of the Verdun sector roughly every 2 weeks, or whenever a unit had lost about half its strength. This meant the Germans always faced relatively fresh troops, but it would horribly backfire for the French command, because the horror of Verdun wasn't contained to one part of the army. It spread across pretty much the whole nation. A huge portion of French soldiers went through that rotation, and what those men saw and experienced there would later cause direct refusal of orders when they were sent into suicide attacks again, because they all knew how pointless it was and that they were literally being sent to die. But for now, the immediate crisis was somewhat stabilized and a complete collapse prevented. And with that, the battle entered its darkest phase yet. The French had positioned artillery on 2 hills on the west side of the Meuse, one colourfully called Dead Man's Hill and the other Hill 304. From here they had a clear view of the advancing German forces on the right bank and were hitting their flanks, decimating German charges toward the Verdun fortifications. So, the Germans realised they couldn't keep pushing toward Verdun without first silencing those guns. On March 6th, after a bombardment just as heavy as the one that opened the battle, they extended the attack to the left bank. The objective was to take those 2 hills and clear out the French artillery behind them. What followed was 3 months of the most savage fighting of the entire battle, in conditions that soldiers on both sides later described as the worst thing they experienced in the entire war. And these were men who had already been through the opening phase on the right bank. One side would take a position, the other would counterattack. Positions changed hands multiple times in a single day, and the casualties were staggering on both sides. There were no proper trenches anymore. The shelling was so constant and so heavy that the ground was nothing but overlapping shell craters, a moonscape of mud, water, and human remains. Soldiers lived in those craters, connected by shallow ditches scraped into the earth. There was no shelter from the weather or from the shells. The dead couldn't be recovered, because anyone who showed themselves above ground was killed, so bodies stayed where they fell and were slowly churned into the mud by subsequent explosions. Men slept next to corpses. They used them as cover. They built them into the walls of whatever position they were holding. The rats came in enormous numbers to feed, and the smell is something that can't really be described by us who weren't there, but those who experienced it said it was something they never forgot. Now, we can't really show you those photos here, but if you want to give yourself some nightmares, go ahead and look it up on the internet after this video, but I honestly don't really recommend it. Clean water was almost non-existent. Carrying parties trying to bring water forward were shot to pieces. One German soldier described seeing a man, driven insane by thirst, drink from a pond covered in green slime as a bloated body floated in the water. Dysentery was everywhere. Survivors coming out of the line were described as speechless skeletons. The average life expectancy of a soldier sent to fight at Verdun was about 14 days. By the end of May, the Germans had taken both hills on the left bank, but at a cost so enormous that it hadn't actually solved the problem. The French just pulled their artillery back behind the hills and kept firing. Hill 304 had been physically reduced in height by about 23 feet from the concentrated shell fire. 10,000 French dead on that one hill alone. Now, before we move on to the horrors that came next, something happened inside German-held Fort Douaumont that shows just how horrific conditions had become even for the side that was supposedly winning. Fort Douaumont was built to hold about 600 men. By this point, there were about 3,000 German soldiers packed inside. Corridors were crammed with men, equipment, ammunition, French shells that hadn't been cleared out, and canisters of flamethrower fuel, all stored wherever there was space, among which soldiers basically lived, smoked, and cooked. What could possibly go wrong, right? Well, as it turns out, everything, and in a way that no one could have even dreamed of. On the morning of May 8th, at about 4:30 in the morning, something went wrong on the lower floor. The exact cause was never established for certain, but the most widely accepted account is that soldiers were brewing coffee using overturned cordite cases as a stove and gunpowder scooped out of hand grenades as fuel. A fire broke out and ignited the flamethrower fuel stored nearby. Thick black smoke started filling the lower corridors. Soldiers down there, their faces blackened by the smoke, panicked and ran up the stairs to the upper level. And here is where it turned into a catastrophe inside a catastrophe. The troops on the upper floor saw these black-faced figures rushing up the stairs, and in the confusion and darkness, mistook them for black French colonial soldiers who they thought had somehow broken into the fort. They started shouting, "The blacks are coming," and threw hand grenades at their own men. The grenades hit the French shell depot. The shells detonated and set off the hand grenade and detonator stores. 3 massive explosions ripped through the fort in sequence. Every light went out. The shockwave tore through the narrow corridors. We can't really go into too much detail here without the video getting taken down from YouTube, but let's just say that all those people packed among explosives and flamethrower fuel inside a concrete enclosed space didn't come out of it looking the same. They fought each other to get out of the burning fort, blocking the exits in panic. Between 700 and 800 German soldiers died, and about 2,000 more were injured. In a catastrophe inside, what was already one of the most horrifying battles in human history, as if that wasn't already enough. And because the fort was under constant artillery fire, the Germans couldn't remove the bodies. The remains of those men are still sealed inside Fort Douaumont today. After the explosion, the surviving garrison didn't leave. They stayed and kept fighting. But the soldiers who had to live and sleep in that fort with their dead comrades walled up a few corridors away had a new name for the place. They called it der Sargdeckel, the coffin lid. Now, with the left bank hills taken but the problem still unsolved, the Germans turned their full attention back to the right bank. What came next, through June and July, would be the most desperate phase of the entire battle, and the closest the Germans ever came to actually taking Verdun. By early June 1916, between the Germans and Verdun, there were really only a few positions left. The next major fort in their path was Fort Vaux, a smaller fort about 2 miles southeast of Douaumont. Behind that, the last line of defense was a ridge running through a small village called Fleury, and ending at Fort Souville, which was the final fort before the ground dropped away down into Verdun. If Souville fell, there was nothing left. The Germans could see the city, and it was over. But before the siege of Fort Vaux, something needs to be said about the fort itself. It was much smaller than Douaumont, roughly a quarter of its size. It also had been stripped of most of its defenses the year before, and had no artillery whatsoever. Its concrete walls had 7 breaches in them, plugged only with sandbags. And instead of the 150 men it was built for, there were now over 600 crammed inside. Most of them wounded, or stragglers from units that had been decimated in the surrounding fighting. Inside the fort was Major Sylvain Eugène Raynal. Reynal, who was 49 years old and walked with a cane because of wounds he had received in 1914, 4 carrier pigeons, and a cocker spaniel named Queequeg. On June 1st, the Germans launched a massive assault on the fort as part of an operation they called Make Up. About 40,000 German troops attacked the area around Vaux, and the fort was already being hit by approximately 8,000 shells per day. On the morning of June 2nd, German pioneer troops used flamethrowers to silence the French machine guns covering the moat, then crossed it and scrambled up onto the roof of the fort. They blew open a steel door with demolition charges. What followed was something that had never happened before in the war. A full-scale battle fought entirely inside a fortification. The corridors of Fort Vaux were barely 3 feet wide. Major Reynal had ordered sandbag barricades built throughout the interior, zigzag walls with small holes for firing machine guns and throwing grenades. So, the fighting became a corridor by corridor, barricade by barricade nightmare in near total darkness. Grenades detonated in concrete enclosed spaces, where the blast was far more amplified than in the open, and the rounds ricocheted off the concrete walls in every direction. The tumbling bullets caused horrific wounds because they were no longer flying straight when they hit soldiers. The air became unbreathable, thick with cordite smoke and dust. There was nowhere to take the wounded and nowhere to put the dead, so both stayed in the corridors alongside the men still fighting. On June 4th, the Germans brought 6 flamethrowers inside the fort and began pouring fire down the access tunnels, trying to burn the defenders out. Major's men checked the fort's water cistern and discovered it was nearly empty, just about 30 liters of contaminated water left at the bottom. At another entrance, the French managed to capture one of the German flamethrowers and turned it on the attackers. On June 5th, the Germans took the last usable latrine in the fort, then sealed the ventilation shafts and pumped smoke and poison gas into the interior. And through all of this, the Germans never penetrated more than about 70 yards into the fort. That's how fiercely the French fought in those corridors. For the last 3 days of the siege, the garrison had effectively no water at all. Men drank their own urine. They licked moisture and slime off the fort's damp stone walls, while the rations they had were mostly salted pork, which doesn't really go down well with completely dry throats. Reynal's only way to communicate with the outside was by carrier pigeon, and by June 4th he was down to his last one, pigeon named Le Vaillant. The bird was already weak from gas exposure, and soldiers were carrying it to a loophole to let it breathe fresh air to keep it alive. At 11:30 in the morning on June 4th, Major attached his final message to the pigeon and released it. "We are still holding, but we are undergoing an attack by gas and very dangerous smoke. It is urgent to relieve us. This is my last pigeon." Le Vaillant flew through gas, smoke, and enemy fire to the French dovecote at the Verdun citadel. The pigeon delivered the message and died shortly afterward. It was awarded the Légion d'honneur, the only pigeon to receive that medal during the entire war, along with the Croix de Guerre and the designation Mort pour la France, died for France. The bird was preserved and put in a museum. On the evening of June 6th, after 6 days of underground fighting with no water, Reynal and his 4 surviving officers decided to surrender. French casualties were about 50 dead and 87 wounded inside the fort. German casualties for the 6-day siege were 2,742 soldiers plus 64 officers dead, which shows you what it cost the attackers to take a fort that was already half-wrecked and completely without artillery. After the surrender, when German troops finally entered the fort, they were shocked to see French soldiers and the cocker spaniel Queequeg crawling out to drink from muddy shell holes outside. Now, with Fort Vaux in German hands, the situation for the French became truly desperate. The Germans now held both of the major forts on the right bank. The only thing standing between them and Verdun was that last ridge, running through the village of Fleury to Fort Souville. Over the following weeks, Fleury changed hands 16 times. Not 16 skirmishes. 16 times the village was taken and lost by one side or the other, with unspeakable casualties and destruction. By the time it was over, the village had ceased to exist. Not a single building was left standing. It was wiped off the earth completely. Fleury was one of 9 villages around Verdun that were completely erased by the fighting and never rebuilt. After the war, they were declared to have died for France, forbidden for habitation or farming because the ground was so saturated with explosives, poison gas residue, and human remains. On June 22nd, the Germans launched what was supposed to be the decisive blow. The evening before, 230 German guns fired over 110,000 phosgene gas shells at the French artillery positions behind the lines. This was a new gas variant that German chemists believed would defeat the French gas masks. It killed or wounded about 1,600 French artillery artillerymen, the whole point being to knock out the guns before the infantry attack. The next morning, 3 German army corps, roughly 50 to 60,000 men, attacked on a 4-mile front. It was the single largest German assault of the entire campaign. The French front came within a hair's breadth of breaking completely. On June 23rd, as the crisis was going on, General Robert Nivelle, who had replaced Pétain in direct command, issued an order telling his troops, "Vous ne les laisserez pas passer, mes camarades," which means, "You will not let them pass, my comrades." This became the legendary "Ils ne passeront pas," "They shall not pass." Most people associate it with Pétain, but it was Nivelle who actually said it. But the Germans weren't done, and they made one final attempt. After firing 300,000 shells and sending in about 40,000 men, a small group of about 150 German soldiers actually made it onto the roof of the last fort. And for one fleeting moment in 10 months of fighting, German soldiers stood on top of Fort Souville and saw the city of Verdun in the distance. The thing their entire army had been fighting and dying for since February was right there in front of them. However, they couldn't take it. A French lieutenant, Kleber Dupuy, had taken shelter inside the fort with about 60 men. He led his small group out and drove them off, and then the French artillery, thinking the position had fallen, began shelling their own fort. So, by the summer of 1916, the German offensive at Verdun had stalled. They had been attacking for 5 months. They held 2 forts and some hills, and they were nowhere close to taking the city. And Falkenhayn's whole plan to bleed France white by forcing them to defend Verdun at any cost had a fatal flaw that was now becoming obvious. France was bleeding, yes, but so was Germany. The plan assumed that Germany could inflict casualties at a ratio that favored them. But in reality, the losses were almost even. What finally broke the German offensive wasn't anything that happened at Verdun itself. The Russians launched their offensive on the Eastern Front and shattered the Austro-Hungarian army, and Germany had to pull divisions away from Verdun to stop the collapse. Then, on July 1st, the British and French launched the Battle of the Somme, which forced even more German troops and guns away. The German attack at Verdun simply ran out of men and ammunition to keep going. On August 29th, the man behind the whole strategy was fired. Now, one more disaster happened in early September that most people have never heard of. Behind the lines on the right bank, there was a railway tunnel about 1,000 meters long called the Tavannes Tunnel. It was being used simultaneously as a barracks, a first aid station, an ammunition depot, and a staging area. The conditions inside were horrible. No latrines, blocked ventilation, about 3,000 men packed into a space with almost no air. On the evening of September 4th, a mule loaded with signal flares and ammunition panicked inside the tunnel. The flares ignited. The mule bolted deeper in spreading the fire, and the flames reached the gasoline and ammunition stores, and explosions ripped through the confined space. At least 500 French soldiers died, while the survivors who made it outside were welcomed by German shelling. The Germans never even knew it happened, and the French military completely censored the incident. The French then launched counteroffensives and took back almost everything the Germans had captured. Fort Douaumont was retaken on October 24th after massive 400mm railway guns made it uninhabitable. Fort Vaux was found empty on November 2nd after the Germans had quietly abandoned it. By December 18th, after one final push, the battle was officially over. It had lasted 302 days. The front line was almost exactly where it had been on the morning of February 21st before the first shell was fired. French casualties were roughly 377,000, of whom about 162,000 were dead or missing. German casualties were roughly 337,000, with about 143,000 dead or missing. Combined, about 714,000 men, of whom roughly 300,000 were killed. About 70% of all casualties at Verdun were caused by shell fire. Approximately 60 million shells were fired, one roughly every 2 seconds for 10 months, and none of it achieved anything. The line didn't move. France's rotation system had cycled 75% of its entire army through Verdun, spreading the trauma across the whole nation. When a new offensive was ordered in 1917, the army mutinied. Thousands of soldiers who had survived Verdun refused to attack again, for reasons you've now seen with your own eyes. An estimated 60,000 soldiers are still in the ground there, never recovered. Unexploded shells are found every year, many still containing active chemical agents. Experts say it could take 300 to 700 years to fully clear the area. Over 130,000 soldiers, French and German, bones mixed together and impossible to tell apart, rest in the Douaumont ossuary. Aren't we as a species just something special?